Tonight's story is by Black Volumes. Links in the description below. It all started in 2012, following my 5-year-old brother's death. Grief made itself at home in the deep wound left by the loss of our mother only 3 years earlier. I was only 9 years old, too young to endure such agony. Then again, I don't know whether anybody would be able to bear what I've seen and felt. After Eric passed, it was just Dad and me, but I felt, in a way, as if I'd buried my father too. Or, at least, buried the version of him I had once known. Eric's funeral seemed to break him. In fairness, my father has always been inward and reclusive, but he became worse after my brother died. Some nights, he'd leave my dinner on the table, then I wouldn't see him until the morning. I miss Eric, I tearfully confessed one evening, and Dad simply replied, "We need to move on, Lorna." Maybe that would have been easier if I hadn't felt so isolated. Knowing what I know now, however, I wonder whether I should be thankful. I was a meek child, and trauma has left me a meeker adult. The meek go unnoticed, and that may well have saved me. At some point in late 2012, I spent the weekend with my grandparents, and when I returned, I immediately noticed quite a pronounced difference in the house. "Where is it?" I asked as I lugged my suitcase across the upstairs landing. "Where's what?" my dad asked in a flat tone. I nodded my head at the white plaster on the ceiling above. "The attic door." He frowned. "We don't have an attic, Lorna." I rolled my eyes. "What's between the ceiling and the roof, then?" "That space is structural," my father said softly. "It's not accessible." That made no sense to me, but I was young, too young to question my parents' supposed wisdom. Of course, I knew the attic door had existed, but I assumed that Dad had been playing a practical joke. That filled me with hope. Hope that, for the first time in many months, his sense of humor may have returned. Still, as the years went by, and the attic door remained only in my assured memory, I began to feel quite uneasy. I hated walking underneath that ceiling and seeing only white, rather than the wooden door which had once been there. Maybe I would have eventually got over it, would have come to believe that I'd simply misremembered my childhood, if it hadn't been for my dad's conviction that I'd lost my mind. A strange, abrasive conviction. He always seemed to be on the verge of losing his patience. Still, Dad promised that there was nothing but foam, wood, and wiring chases in the space between the second-floor ceiling and the property's sloping roof above. No space for a proper attic, according to him. Anyhow, by the time I entered my teenage years, I'd stopped asking about the loft space from my childhood. Stopped caring, truth be told. I became buried in school, then college, then university. All the while, I drifted farther and farther away from Dad, And that came down to more than the ceiling. Our relationship has only become more strained as the years have gone by. And the same is true of every relationship my father forms. He broke up with Jenna just before Christmas, which turned him cold and standoffish. I've never liked him in that state. And admittedly, I missed Jenna. She'd been somewhat of a warm, comforting presence in the house for the past 4 years. In spite of this, the first alarm bell only started ringing this morning, around 3 in the morning to be exact, a few hours before I needed to get up for work. I was woken by a series of noises. They came from above. 3 weighty, board-buckling creaks. It wasn't the sound of the ceiling settling. Wasn't the sound of rats burrowing through those supposed wiring chases in the inaccessible loft space. Rather, it was the sound that confirmed what I'd always known. Something was moving around above me, in the very real attic. But I didn't call out, didn't investigate. Instead, I clung to the edge of my sweaty duvet and lay silently, swallowing the shriek that wanted to escape. I've mastered the art of burying fear. Part of me knew that the call out would be a very, very unwise idea. The part of me that had been suppressing things since I was old enough to remember them. The things that happened even whilst Eric and Mom were alive. I remember the set of eyeballs that would watch me from the crack in my ajar bedroom door. Sometimes I'd wake during the night and see them disappear into the black. I remember the time Dad stood and watched as I, barely more than a toddler, flailed helplessly in a swimming pool. I'm sure I've forgotten worse things, but I'll never forget what I saw this morning. This morning, something possessed me. Some new source of courage, or more likely delirium. My dad went to work, and I had time before my shift. So I went into the garage, fetched a sizable hammer, and returned to the upstairs landing. I took to the ceiling with a series of swings, tearing a hole through the white plaster with alarming ease. At first, I thought I'd underestimated my own strength, but then I realized there had been next to nothing in the form of resistance from the ceiling. Nothing to prevent my remodeling project. I spat plaster and dust from my wide mouth. Then I eyeballed the black abyss above me. I knew it. I'd known it for 13 years. The space above the second floor wasn't filled with piles of foam and wooden beams and wires. It was a black, empty void. There was, and always had been, room up there. There had always been an attic. Part of me wants to end here, but I'm currently sitting in a police station, trying to keep my mind off of everything. So I'm going to tell you what I told them. I set up a ladder on the landing, climbed into the attic, then lit the space with my phone flashlight. Now, I don't know how the loft space used to look. After all, I hardly had reason to go up there as a 9-year-old. However, whatever purpose it once served, it serves a new one now. I hurled my guts across the floorboards when my light caught the first of the bodies. A woman was bundled up in a large, translucent plastic bag, a maggot-filled bag. The remaining flesh of her bloody face was peeling away to reveal a wide-mouthed skull, but enough features remained to identify her. It was Jenna. As I moved the flashlight beam, I nearly lost my footing on the ladder. I wasn't horrified by the sight of Jenna, not even by the sight of many other plastic-wrapped corpses, some little more than ashes in tattered clothes. I wobbled in fear when I saw the shrine, for lack of a better word, near the back of the attic, surrounded by fresh, burning candles, were two long, rectangular wooden crates. Crates with what seemed to be sturdy lids and brass clasps. These were no crates. I know that. About half an hour ago, an officer informed me that my father hadn't returned home. They haven't found him. Sooner or later, I have to leave this place, but I don't want to do that. I'm terrified. I should feel safe, apparently. The police officers have promised to get me far away from here. They've promised to watch me, to protect me. They promised not to let me out of their sight. How on earth will they keep that promise? Nobody's ever stopped my father from making things disappear before. His eyes opened to the sound of Alice's bedroom door squealing open. Sleep tugged at him, but his parental sense demanded that he get her back into bed. He heard her bare feet slap on the naked floorboards as he rolled out of the warm envelopment of his blankets. He clumsily put on his slippers and stumbled out into the living room. At the apartment, she had always slept fine, even when she had been a baby. It was only since the move to this house that she had started acting strangely in the night. Getting up, wandering the house, talking to her friend. The kid seemed a bit old to invent an imaginary friend, but it was an improvement. The first few nights in the house, Alice had woken the whole neighborhood screaming. From the kitchen wafted the sound of soft weeping. He followed and was greeted by an unexpected sight. His tiny daughter, dressed in her nightgown, standing in front of the open basement door. She just stood there, looking down into the basement, quietly sobbing. He thought it strange she had not put on the light, and even stranger that she would stand in front of the scariest place in the house, alone, in the dark. He approached her, put his hand on her shoulder, and gently suggested, "Let's go back to bed, honey." Without looking or acknowledging him, she slowly lifted her arm and pointed down into the basement. Had she thought she had heard something? Was that why she was up? He let his eyes follow her finger into the blackness. Softly, comfortingly, he said, "There's nothing down there, honey. Let's go back to bed." Without even looking at him, she just continued to sob and point. Something felt wrong, but he had to put a stop to this behavior. She needed to feel safe in her new home, and to put away all these childish fears. Explanations hadn't worked. Now he had to show her. He stepped down onto the first creaking wooden step, leaned forward, and flipped the light switch. The illumination shocked his eyes, but fortified his resolve as he heavily strode down to the very bottom of the stairs. With confidence in his voice, he looked about and proclaimed, "Nothing down here, honey. I don't know what you heard, but..." Silently and abruptly, the light went out. Terror struck. He looked back up the stairs. There, his daughter stood in silhouette, no longer pointing, but standing motionless. Eyes wide, he watched the door, as though swung by a powerful unseen hand, swing shut, leaving him in the most utter of darkness. He bounded up the stairs, once, twice, stopped and reached forward for the knob to escape. He reached, but his hand found nothing. He swung wildly for the switch, but found only smooth, bare wall. Gingerly, he stepped forward and continued to reach. Surely the door must be close enough to feel by now. Slowly, he took another step, his hands blindly groping into the nothingness ahead, and his feet constantly misjudging the next step. One more step, 2 more, 3, 4. He climbed, and his speed and panic increased. It had already been at least several floors worth of stairs. How was this possible? Maybe he should try to go back down. It would be easier. Remembering that the basement stairs ran under his own bedroom, he cried for his wife. "Vanessa!" His voice seemed unusually loud, as if in a confined space, and echoed back towards him from below. The echo pushed him beyond attempting to rationalize this insanity, and settled any contemplation about going down. No, going down into inky, echoing nothingness seemed like a very bad idea. Better to go up into inky, silent nothingness. Cautiously, sightlessly, he resumed his climb, feeling ahead into nothing with his outstretched hands. So many stairs, and his legs ached. He turned and sat on the step. Alone, he felt a solitude more complete than he had ever known. Darkness, desperation, and despondency mixed in his soul as tears began to flow. What was that? He sat bolt upright and held his breath. Was that a sound? He strained his ears but only perceived the pounding of his own veins. Then, distantly, slightly, maybe, like a scrape or a whisper, or just a shifting of air, sound seemed to echo up from below. Adrenaline poured into his veins and overrode his fatigue. He rose and heedlessly dashed up the stairs. Several times he tripped and battered himself on the steps, but still he rose and charged on. Yes, he was sure now. At first barely audible, but rising steadily, a roaring, whirling white noise. It seemed to be all around him, engulfing him, drowning out all other sounds and scents. Blindly, his senses overwhelmed, he frantically sprinted up until... falling. Impact. Pain. Rolling. Hurting. Breaking. It was late the next morning when Vanessa finally awoke. She wrapped herself in her terry cloth bathrobe and made her way towards the kitchen. As she passed Alice's room, her maternal instinct led her to open the door a crack and check in. Her mind was not awake enough to realize the incongruity of the child's room. Dark, with all the shades drawn, and the closet door, in front of which Alice sat, wide open. "Morning, honey." No response. "What are you doing? Do you know where Daddy is?" With an uncharacteristically serious expression, Alice slowly turned her head and responded in her tiny voice, "Talking to my friend." Vanessa withdrew to the kitchen to make her coffee. It took an hour or so for her to finally open the door and find his battered and beaten body at the bottom of the basement stairs. Later, the coroner would speculate that he had run flat into the closed door at the top of the stairs, had fallen back, and broken his neck, and several other bones as he tumbled down. The only really odd thing was that he was so bruised and battered from such a short fall down. So few stairs. A gentle breeze pushed through the screen and tickled my short black hair against my forehead. All the windows were open, but I knew I would have to close them soon. It seemed like a downpour would start momentarily. The waves pushed and crashed against the boats and dock just outside. I began to go around closing the windows, not sure if there were any procedures I had to follow if it began raining. I had only been working here at the marina for 3 days. My radio beeped and shook me from my tranced state. "Sean, you there?" I knew that rough voice anywhere. "Yeah, Ron, what's up?" Ron had never failed to surprise me. I knew just by his complexion when I saw him he was a veteran. But still, the stories he told rattled me to the core. "I'm coming in. It's about to rain," he grumbled in the usual gravelly voice. I chuckled to myself. It reminded me of Batman. "All right, door's unlocked." I set the radio down and peered out the glass door leading onto the docks. There, I saw Ron, slowly limping because of his bad knee. He had told me about the injury and said it was from a grenade, but refused to go into detail. I made him and myself a cup of coffee as the rain began to come down. We both sat, and I continued to look out the window, waiting for the workday to come to an end. Lately, storms had plagued this side of the bay, causing the tide to rise and bring floods. "Looks like the marina is going under again," Ron said, breaking the silence as he glanced at the rising water. "Hopefully not too much this time." I took a sip of the coffee. Last time it was up to our knees. "Your knees." He corrected me and chuckled his raspy laugh. He had always enjoyed making fun of my under-average height. "Hey, at least my eyes aren't as gray as my hair." I grinned, and we both chuckled. The tide slowly rose as the day went on. Ron had decided he would cut his workday short, since it was far too flooded to work on the boats. I stayed, hoping at least one customer would show up, since we also sold beer and cigarettes. For a long while, I stared out the window, before I noticed something on the other side of the boatyard. Past the bobbing ships, I saw a man. He was kneeling beside a dead bird. I gagged, thinking of how bad it must smell, and why this man was even near it. Slowly, he reached down and picked it up by the legs. Blood trickled down its neck and dripped to the ground. I stood and walked over to the window, staring at him, disgusted, but very curious. Suddenly, he snapped his head towards me, causing my legs to go limp and nearly fall backwards when I saw him. What I believed to be his face had no features. Any exposed skin seemed completely out of focus. His clothes, however, were clearly visible. The polo he wore was stained a sickly green color. The longer I looked at him, the more nauseous I felt. I forced myself to look away from the misty complexion. Slowly rubbing my eyes, I looked back up through the window. Streams of rain snaked down the glass. The man and bird were gone. Not a trace that I could see was left. An open field stood all around the area they had been. The only place he could have gone was the water, which seemed to have risen an unusual amount. I instantly called Ron in a panic. He answered, clearly annoyed by my phone call on his break.
"What do you want?"
He grumbled. "I have no idea." I blurted without thinking. "This guy picked up a dead bird and just ran away with it."
"Why is that a problem, Sean?"
There was a pause as I thought about it. Somehow, I knew it wasn't natural, and not just my mind playing tricks on me, but I sure didn't want him thinking I was mentally insane.
"See, there's no problem. Just some weirdo."
He reassured me in a calmer tone. We both hung up, and I went back to my duties, sitting in a chair and hoping I wouldn't see that scene again. The hours passed, and the rain continued to fall. There was no sign of anyone or anything, so I decided to close up for the day. I grabbed my things and made my way down the aisles, setting the alarm and stepping outside. The rain pounded my head as the keys slipped around in my hand, finally making it to the door. Locking it, I began walking to my car, already soaking wet and in no rush. As I walked, I began to slowly notice figures, all standing perfectly still, with their backs to me. The same pounding feeling in my head returned, matching the rapid beats of my heart. Taking slight glances around me, I counted 5 of them. Somehow, they hadn't caught my attention moments ago. I failed to see them when I was locking the door. They all stood next to the ever-rising tide, their ankles half submerged in the water. The clothes they wore didn't seem to be drenched like mine were. Everything about the situation unfolding bothered me. Before I knew it, I was in a full sprint across the parking lot. Water splashed my legs as I ran and clicked the button on my keychain, unlocking the doors to my car before I could grip the handle. I pushed myself into the front seat, bashing my head against the door, causing the pounding feeling in my skull to seem like grenades exploding. Horror fell into the pit of my stomach, and as the tide rose, they advanced, growing closer and extinguishing the feeling of safety my car provided. My breathing became strained, and tears began to sting my eyes. The ignition refused my many attempts to start the car and escape whatever horrors were approaching. Opening the door, I stepped back into the rain. I made a quick dash back to the store. Fumbling for my keys, I jammed them into the lock and swung the door open. Not thinking about the alarm, I slammed the door and hurried behind the counter. I heard the light beeps as the system prepared to scream for help. Being too scared to move, I simply sat and waited. A piercingly loud alarm was raised within a mere few seconds. Something accompanied it, though. Something I couldn't explain. Peering out the window, I saw one of the figures, hands on the sides of its head and mouth wide open. An inhuman shriek came out from between the black, glossy, jagged teeth scattered around in its mouth. I ducked back behind the counter, a legion of screaming creatures surrounding me, and the tide continuing to rise. After what seemed like forever, they finally stopped. Slowly, I peeked out the window once again and saw the tide, rippling from raindrops, now even higher, but without the creatures. 2 bright headlights approached the store, and a truck came skidding to a stop. None other than Ron jumped out, shotgun in hand.
What did you do this time?
I heard him yell from outside. I pressed my fingers to my lips and hissed, "Get in here!"
I don't know what's going on, but if I came down here for nothing,
I could hear the air being forced from his lungs as his body lurched forward. The same out-of-focus creature from earlier standing behind him. Ron stumbled a few feet before regaining his balance and swinging around, his skin clearly becoming pale as he glared at the creature. Its hand flinched as if it were about to grab Ron. Without hesitation, he fired. Pellets speckled the green polo, but the creature didn't so much as move. The surface of its skin rippled and shimmered like water after being struck with a stone. "Run!" I screamed at him. But before the word could leave my mouth, he was already in a sprint toward me, his limp greatly hindering his speed. The shotgun clattered against the pavement and the creature began its pursuit. They got so close to the store I could hear the strained gasps as Ron tried to flee inside. Again, the creature lunged at him. This time they both crashed to the ground and came skidding to a stop inches in front of me. I grabbed his wrist and yanked him halfway through the door frame before a strong resistance came from the other side. A look of suppressed agony was painted on his face. The creature had grabbed him by his injured leg. A firm tug jostled one of his wrists free from my grasp. For the first time, I could see Ron with a look of true terror in his eyes. "Please, don't let go." The tone of his voice shook me deeper than any of his stories ever could. There was a light pop as his leg gave way, and the agony plastered on his face echoed through the marina. I tripped and fell forward, scraping my hands as I caught myself. Ron was being dragged away when I looked up, his knee twisted at an unnatural angle. He shrieked, clawing at the pavement, trying to slow his descent into the water. I forced myself up off the ground and darted after him. My feet splashed through the water as I chased the duo. Ron was being dragged through the water like a heavy sack, his leg suspended in the air by the creature. A light trail of red swirled in the water as the skin on his back was torn apart by the cement. The adrenaline began to wear off, and I became more aware of my surroundings. The tide splashed against my chest, and I realized just how deep I had gone into the water. Panic leaked through my body as my mind took me back 10 years. I could almost remember the exact feeling as water filled my lungs. The sun became darker and more distant as my exhausted 12-year-old body sank to the bottom of the pool. A chill ran down my spine, and I forced the memory out of my head. Ron no longer flailed about in the water. His body seemed limp, and his arms floated behind him. Tearing my eyes from the scene, I turned back and got out of the water as quickly as I could, retreating back into the store. The alarm had become a simple background noise. I focused more on the threats that caused it to the sound in the first place. Knowing they would converge on the store, I found a place to hide. 2 small cabinets in the furthest corner from the water seemed like my best option. I climbed in and waited. Seconds, minutes, hours passed by as I sat there. The rain had slowly stopped, and by what I could tell from the small crack in the door, nobody had come inside. My heart pounded like a drumline as I pushed my way out of the hiding spot. The moon sliced through the dissipating clouds and reflected off the now calm water. Slowly, cautiously, I made my way down the seemingly endless aisle to the door. I could already tell the tide had gone down drastically. The parking lot was how I had left it. Ron's truck and my car were parked a short distance from the store, and the shotgun lay untouched in the headlights. Making my way around the store, I saw them. Hundreds of the creatures, making a hazy, unfocused wall along the tide. One by one, they melted back into the water, their clothes going under with them. A slight feeling of relief washed over me as they and the water fell back into its usual place, though the feeling was quickly overtaken by something stronger. Pure dread. Not that everybody would never believe a single thing I tell them, but I knew I would see them again. I knew I would see Ron again. There was one thing, no matter how hard I tried, I knew I could never change. They came with the tide. My little sister is 13 now. She has blonde hair, blue eyes, and she likes pop music, fashion, and other typical teenage girl stuff. I really do love her. I must have been 7 or 8 when she first came home. I was excited to finally see my little sister. At first, I had been annoyed that the baby was going to be a girl, as I had wanted a little brother. But I was happy when she eventually did come home. This kind of disappeared quickly, though. It was about a week since Zoe first came home. My dog, Rusty, just would not calm down. Whenever he was in the same room as Zoe, he just barked like mad at her. Eventually, as my parents were scared that he would hurt her, they got rid of him. They didn't even talk to me. I just came home one day and he wasn't there. It was only when I asked about it that my mom just casually said, "Oh, we got rid of Rusty. We were worried about Zoe." Then she just went back to feeding Zoe. I was confused. Both of my parents had just abandoned my dog, my best friend, in some pound somewhere, and they didn't even bother talking to me. They weren't even sorry. This was when I first started to gain some disdain towards her. It wasn't her fault, of course. If we had kept the dog, she probably would have loved him too. I just blamed her at the time. When she was 1, I was kicked out of my room. We lived in a 3-bedroom apartment, just on the outskirts of some big city. There was my room, where I kept all of my stuff. My parents' room, which was where Zoe had slept in a cot in the corner. And the tiny guest room. My parents had decided that Zoe should have her own room. But instead of refurbishing the guest room for her, they kicked me out of my room and gave it to her. Any protest I had was quickly silenced. And I could only watch as my room, my one free area that I had had any say in, was transformed. Sports posters were replaced with pictures of ducks and sheep. My bed was replaced with a pink wooden cot. And everything else that made my room mine was changed. They didn't even give me my bed or my TV or anything. All of the things like that were either thrown away or became Zoe's. They refused to refurbish the guest room for me, and I was instead forced to make do with boring, beige walls, an old metal single bed, and a single wooden dresser for my clothes. I did decorate it slightly, of course, with posters and other decorations I had managed to scavenge. But it wasn't the same. My parents seemed more concerned with where any guests we had were going to sleep. This was the point where disdain turned to hatred. It seemed to me as if they had just completely forgotten about me in favor of her. Eventually, my parents decided that I was old enough to be responsible and look after Zoe while they went out. I think she was 3 years old, so she was old enough to speak. I really didn't want to do it, but my parents wouldn't take no for an answer. They simply left, saying that there was some pre-made lunch for her in the fridge. There wasn't one for me, so I had to make myself something. I couldn't be bothered with looking after her all day, as there was this TV show I wanted to watch. So, I just laid a blanket in the corner, put a few of her favorite toys in there, and said this to her: "You need to stay on the blanket. Don't move off it, okay? If you do, Mom and Dad will be really mad. So you have to stay in here. Understand?" She simply nodded her head in agreement and started playing with her toys. I was on the couch, watching my show, my eyes flicking to her when there was a commercial break or some boring segment. At one point, as I was watching two of the characters on my show beating the tar out of each other, I felt a tugging at my trouser leg. I turned to see it was Zoe. She looked up at me, then sighed, "I'm hungry." "I told you not to come off the blanket," I said, shooing her off. She just sat back down on the blanket. I looked back to my show. It was a boring bit again. The victorious character was monologuing over the unconscious body of the loser. I couldn't just not feed her. Harsh feelings aside, I got up and walked to the kitchen. As I was opening the fridge to get her lunch, I heard her say from the other room, "Daddy won't come." I was confused, but not enough to stop me in my tracks. "What did you say?" I asked, carrying her lunch over to her. "He won't come." "Come where?" "Here. Back." I was quite unnerved by this, but I didn't think anything of it. About half an hour later, the phone rang. I didn't check the number, assuming it was my mom. But instead, a male voice that wasn't my dad's came through the receiver. "Hello, is this Daniel and Zoe?" The voice sounded serious and kind of upset and disturbed. Yeah, I'm Daniel. Who is this?" The voice then proceeded to explain to me, nice and clearly, that there had been a traffic accident. My mom was in critical yet stable condition, but my dad was not so lucky. He had survived the initial collision, but died on the way to the hospital. The next few hours were a blur. I just switched off the TV and stared at the blank screen as I waited for my Uncle Jared, who was married to my dad's older sister, my Aunt Louise, to pick me and Zoe up. We spent the next few days at his house. My aunt was inconsolable. I was just dull. I didn't speak. I barely left the bedroom I was in. Zoe was too young to grasp the situation, but they said she understood that Dad was gone. The only thing I was thinking of until my mom came out of the hospital and we could go back home was what Zoe had said to me. It was as if she somehow knew what was going to happen. I didn't forget about it. It got to the point where it was unnerving to be in the same room as her. Another similar incident didn't come until much later, however. A year, to be exact. It was a nice, sunny day. We all went for a walk in the park. Me, somewhat reluctantly, as by this point we had decorated my new room and I had a TV, which I had plugged a PS2 into. My mom held my sister's hand, and I walked slightly behind, hands buried in my pockets and generally wishing to be home. It was all quiet, nobody really speaking, when Zoe pointed to an inconspicuous-looking guy in a hoodie. All she said was, "There's a bad man over there." My mom turned to look. A man in a gray sweatshirt stood by a fountain. He was staring at his feet, hands in his pockets. I looked too. Something about him did seem rather off, but I didn't think much of it. It was later on, when we had left the park and were in the car on the way home, that I remembered how she had predicted Dad's death. I leaned over to her. "Zoe, what did you say about the man in the park? The bad man?" She turned to me. Her face was covered in chocolate from the chocolate bars Mom had given us. "The man had a knife. He was sad about something. He wanted to change it." She then turned back to look out the window. I was just frozen. He was sad about something. He wanted to change it? I wanted to ask my mom to call the police, but I knew she'd find it ridiculous. I just stared out my window too. The next morning, I was up before anyone else. I saw the local newspaper had arrived. So, I picked it up to put it on the coffee table for Mom to read. As I did, I glanced at the front page headline, and I dropped the paper and almost jumped back in horror. "Family of 5 stabbed to death in home." Beneath it was a mugshot. A man in a gray sweatshirt. It was then that I realized Zoe had a talent. I stopped being distant and uncaring of her, and instead listened carefully to what she had to say about anything, asking her about random things that we saw. I would write down anything I found particularly interesting in a notebook I kept in my room. There wasn't anything major. She worked out when the goldfish was going to die, but that was the biggest thing. I eventually figured out that she could only make predictions linked to deaths. When she was 6, something big happened. She was watching some little girl TV show, eating chips, when the phone rang. She turned to face my mom's boyfriend, David, as he picked up the phone. "Oh no," she said. I was on the other side of the couch reading a comic book. I looked over to her, expecting that something had just happened on the show, but she was staring at David. "What is it?" I asked. "Grandpa," she said, still looking. I froze. I could feel in my gut that this was another prediction. We watched David talk on the phone. "Yes? Oh my God, really? Jesus, I'll tell Kathy. Okay, goodbye." Then he hung up. He noticed that both of us were looking at him, and a sullen look came over him. "Oh, geez. Kids, I have some bad news." I knew what he was going to tell us before he even said it. Grandpa had passed away in his sleep. Mom was sad. Zoe was sad. I tried to be sad about Grandpa, and I was. I was just more amazed and creeped out at Zoe. How did she do it? That was the last prediction for a long time. I eventually forgot about it, just chalking it up to coincidence. Last week, I got a phone call. Checking the caller ID, I saw that it was Zoe. I hadn't spoken to her in about a month, so I was pretty happy to see her name on my phone. I took the call. "Hey, Zoe, how are you?" Dan, are you there? I need to talk to you. Are you alone? My girlfriend was sitting next to me, watching TV. Hold on, I'll move, I said, standing up. My girlfriend looked to me. Who is it? It's just my sister. I need to talk to her in the other room. She just shrugged and turned back to the TV. I closed the door to my bedroom behind me. I need you to listen to me. I got a terrible feeling, as if I knew something was going to happen. You and Megan should get out of your house. Go to a hotel or something. Just get out of there. I couldn't speak. Not only did she predict something again, but she was aware of the seriousness of the situation. Meagerly, I managed to say, "Okay, thank you." I hung up. Then I rushed back into the room where my girlfriend was sitting and watching the TV. "Megan, we need to leave." "Why? What's wrong?" My sister had another prediction. We could be in danger. I had told her about the predictions, but she never believed any of it, or chalked it up to mere coincidence. Are you kidding? I'm not going anywhere because your 13-year-old sister thinks we should. I told you about her predictions. This is serious, I shouted. After an hour of bickering and arguing, she finally agreed to leave. We went to a nearby hotel, booked a room for one night, and went to sleep. The next morning, I got a call from the neighbor. He said our house had been broken into, but nothing was taken. I told my girlfriend, and she was utterly dumbfounded. How in the hell did she know? Was all she said. We talked to the police, and I called my neighbor and told him to call the police if they returned. We stayed at the hotel again that night. When morning came round, I was woken by my phone ringing. It was the police. We went to the police station, and apparently Megan's mentally unstable ex-boyfriend broke into our house with a knife. They had arrested him when the neighbor called the police. It was obvious to all of us what he was going to do. My girlfriend hadn't said a thing. She was just completely blown away by what my sister had done. Without her, I would probably be dead. I talked to my sister about it, and all she said was this one thing. I could see your bodies lying on the bed. You were next to Dad, Grandpa, and 5 other people I didn't know. I've never felt more haunted than I did after hearing her say that. Nobody else believes it. Even my girlfriend is still skeptical. But I know for sure that my sister has a gift. This was Peter's favorite time of year, late fall. Almost all the leaves had fallen from the trees, and the crisp, cool temperatures made for almost perfect weather for him. Peter was a mailman in a somewhat affluent suburb of the city, doing one of the few remaining runs that still had delivery door to door. He would start at one end of the neighborhood, and at a good work rate, would be able to complete his deliveries before 2 in the afternoon. He enjoyed his work, and tried to keep a quick pace, both for the health benefit it provided, and to be able to finish his day early. He never saw many people on his run. Those he came across would make like he wasn't there, a part of the background, if you will. Peter didn't mind much. He would just smile after trying to make some eye contact, then continue on his way. It was early one morning, a little bit into his route, when he came across a little boy sitting on the steps of an older house. He may have delivered here 100 times already, if not more. Rarely did he see anyone around that place, but from his vague memory, he recalls he may have come across this boy once or twice. This time seemed different, like he almost was waiting for him. He was no more than 10, a bit pale, with sandy blonde hair, piercing blue eyes, and almost no expression on his face. He never took his eyes off of Peter as he sat there on the steps, waiting for the mailman to make his delivery. Peter thrust a letter into the boy's outstretched hand and gave him a smile. He continued on his way, oblivious to the boy's eyes as they followed him down the street. The next day was similar, only the boy was at a house further up the street, earlier on his run. Peter went through the motions, putting the envelopes in the boy's hand, and walked towards the next house. Although he knew that the boy probably didn't live at the house he found him at, he almost felt compelled to hand him the mail. Every day, their little game continued, and every day the boy was waiting at a house further and further up the street. Peter would spot the boy from a distance, and sure enough, there would always be a delivery for the house where the boy sat. There were never any words exchanged between them, but a general uneasiness on Peter's part started to become quite evident every time he approached the steps where the lad sat. Peter started being very anxious about this part of his job. He felt a sense of dread as he would approach the boy and almost be frightened in his presence. Peter could feel that something just wasn't right with the whole situation. The next day started like any other, but as he made his way towards the boy's street, he realized that the object of his angst would probably be at the first house on the block, due to him moving up the street a few houses each day. He turned the corner and was greeted with a makeshift memorial right on the curb. Propped up on the lamppost were flowers, crosses, little stuffed animals, and a few toys. Warily, Peter looked over to the first house, almost shaking. "The memorial is for the boy. It must be for the boy," Peter thought. He looked over to the house, half expecting not to see him. The boy, however, was there, sitting on the steps waiting for him. The scene seemed even scarier this time, given Peter's revelation. The boy was looking down at his own feet this time, a few tears visible on his pale cheeks. The mailman reluctantly approached him with his usual letters and put them in his hand. "Do you know what happened here?" Peter asked the boy. The little boy looked up a bit and nodded, more tears streaming down his cheeks. He pointed to the memorial at the foot of the lamppost, and then upwards to a paper taped at eye level that Peter didn't notice. Even though he couldn't read the words from where he was, he knew what the newspaper clipping said. "That's about you, isn't it?" Peter asked, his voice almost breaking. He couldn't believe he was speaking with a child who had died tragically at this spot. "No," the boy answered, almost in a whisper. "It's about both of us." Peter put his head in his hands and sobbed uncontrollably. The memories of the accident came flooding back. The car careening out of control. Him trying to push the boy out of the way. The hit and run that disastrously took both their lives. "What's your name?" Peter asked as he tried to compose himself with this new truth. "Michael," said the boy in a bit of a stronger voice than before. "Well, Michael, I think I can finish early today," Peter told him. He put his mailbag down onto the manicured lawn and started walking down the street, leaving the makeshift memorial on the corner behind them. Michael got up off the steps and followed. I've always been an avid outdoorsman. Hiking, trail running, mountain biking. I love it all. There is just something so soothing about being out in nature that makes the stresses of life drift away. I could spend my life out in wilderness and never get tired of it. That is, until I hiked Sweet Connie Trail. The terrain on this hike was pretty difficult. A near constant incline up the face of a rocky mountain slope. It would take about 8 hours to complete the hike in each direction. With a hike so hard, it's reasonable not to see many people undertaking this daunting task. And frankly, I like it that way. The more secluded, the better. On my way up the mountain, I only ran into a few hikers, but there was something strange in their demeanors. I would give each of them a cordial, "Hello, hi, how's it going?" But none of them returned the sentiment. Instead, they just looked at me in shock. I gave each of them a polite smile and continued my way up the trail. Soon, all other hikers disappeared, and I was the only person left on the trail. As I rounded a sharp corner, I heard the rustling of leaves coming from the underbrush off to the side of the path. I didn't think anything of it. It isn't uncommon to hear sounds off in the brush while you're out alone. Most of the time, it's just the wind. But as I came closer, the brush thrashed around rather violently. Like any other logical person, I ran through the list of possible culprits. A squirrel? No, it was too large to be a squirrel. Rabbit? A rabbit would have already darted away in search of cover. Suddenly, a laugh drifted out from the foliage. The laugh was innocent, high pitch, young. A little girl stepped out into the middle of the trail, her back toward me. She was wearing a pink dress, dirty and torn. Her feet were bare, her back tense. I stood there for a second or two, trying to wrap my mind around what I was seeing. She looked hypothermic, her skin icy and pale. She caressed her own arms as if trying to get warm. The little girl's head was slumped down, looking at the path beneath her exposed feet. When the sight before me finally registered, I stepped forward. "Are you okay?" I asked, in my best non-threatening voice. There was no response, but the little girl did acknowledge my question. She lifted her head, looking at the long trail ahead of us. "What's your name?" Taking another step, the girl's chest began hiccuping, and she huffed in spurts as she started to sob. Hey, don't cry. I'm going to help you," I said while taking off my jacket, readying myself to drape it against her back. But as I placed the jacket against her exposed skin, she didn't reach for it. It now lay haphazardly across her shoulders, ready to fall to the ground with the slightest movement. "What are you doing out here alone?" I asked, concern filling my voice. Suddenly, the little girl's sobbing stopped, and an uncanny silence fell around us. Nothing made a noise. Not the wind, the birds, the trees. It was as if time had stopped. The silence was broken when the little girl began giggling once again. It started slowly, as if she was trying to hold it in, but giddiness engulfed her, and she started giving a cheery laugh. The little girl lifted a hand to her hair. Her little fingers grasped a handful of her messy black locks, twirling the strands around her grip, and slowly pulling away from her head. Her scalp stretched as her hand pulled harder. I took a step back in horror when a few hairs unrooted from her head, my jaw dropping when the handful was yanked free. Her other hand lifted to her head. This time, she wasted no time in ripping the hairs from her scalp, my jacket falling to the floor as she did. The hairs hadn't touched the ground by the time her hand returned to her head. She now frantically ripped her hair free, her giggle morphing into a maniacal cackle. It hadn't been more than a few handfuls, and her head was looking more like a Sarna-riddled dog's. "Hey, stop that!" I said, as my stiff limbs finally moved. I gripped the little girl's wrist, stopping her from tearing out another clump of hair. When I did, her laughter instantly stopped, the fingers on her hand balling in apparent anger. I felt her muscles tense before she wrenched her arm out of my grasp. Her hand returned to her head. "Stop!" I said with more conviction, stopping her from yanking more hair out. The little girl didn't take kindly to it this time, and she swung her arm back in a sudden burst of supernatural strength. I was shoved back, my backside meeting the exposed earth. I returned to the path ahead, but the little girl was gone. I looked around, expecting to see the girl running through the trees, but my gaze was only met with the dimly lit pine forest. The hairs on the back of my head stood as a familiar laugh drifted through the woods. It sounded distant and muffled, but as I frantically searched for the little girl, she was nowhere to be found, her giggle mocking me from the darkness. Looking at the path ahead, I saw a figure standing in the distance. She wasn't there before, yet there she stood, the little girl, yanking out her hair in handfuls. When there was no more hair left to pull, she started sobbing again. Freaked out by the situation, I motioned to stand, trying to avoid garnering the attention of the bald figure off in the distance. But as I took to my feet, a few rocks crunched under my weight. The little girl instantly stopped crying as the sound met her ear. Her hands, which once plucked at her head, now fell to her side. My heart thudded in my chest as the silence lingered for a beat or two. She craned her head back, catching a glimpse of me from the side of her gaze, and for the first time, I looked into her eyes. fluid streamed from her ducts. Only it wasn't tears. It was the distinct, deep red of blood. She pivoted on her feet and faced me, my senses screaming, "Run!" as her face came into view. Her skull was partially sunken in, like someone had taken a rock and bashed it against her cranium. She studied me, looking me up and down, unimpressed. I wanted to say something, anything, but I was in shock. The little girl noticed, and a creepy smile slid across her lips, her mouth parting, producing that sweet, innocent laugh. But this time, her laugh got deeper with each inhale. Horror drifted into my body as her eyebrows furrowed, looking at me like prey. I found my courage, and I started to slowly back away. But with each step, the little girl mirrored my pace. "What do you want?" I asked, quiveringly. The girl didn't answer and continued chuckling maniacally. "Please, don't hurt me," I pleaded, desperation evident in my tone. The little girl picked up the pace. I found myself stumbling on my heels, but as I turned around, facing the path that led back to the trailhead, the little girl stood in front of me in the distance, the red fluid still oozing from her eyes. My feet slid across the trail as I came to a screeching halt. I eyed her up and down, stopping when I got to her feet that no longer touched the ground. They now hovered ominously a few inches above the trail. The blood draining from my face. Words festered on my tongue, but caught in my throat, spilling out as a frantic mumble. "What the hell are you?" The little girl stopped her deep demonic chuckle and looked at me mildly offended. Her mouth started to gape open, revealing a larger-than-normal void in her face. With one long inhale, her chest expanded and she let out an ear-piercing roar.
"Leave!"
She screamed, my ears yawning at the bass in her voice. She lifted a gnarled finger and pointed behind her, instructing me to run back down the mountain. Without a second thought, I shot to my feet and scurried around her. The little girl's witchy cackle followed me back down the trail, but when I looked over my shoulder, no one was giving chase. Eventually, the laugh stopped, and the only noises I was hearing were the normal rhythmic chatter of nature and my anguished breathing. But the dread of the situation still played in my mind. I quietly made my way towards the trailhead, but my heart stopped when I saw a lonely figure walking toward me in the distance. My heart was shoved to the pit of my stomach, thinking that it was the little girl again. But to my relief, it was a tall, burly hiker making his way up the hill. His hiking poles dug into the soft ground as he worked his way in my direction. It dawned on me that he was making his way toward that demonic little girl. I needed to say something, but as my warning built up in my chest, a familiar, sweet voice slithered from the trees.
"Leave."
It said. My skin broke out in gooseflesh. The burly man huffed his way around me, giving me a polite smile as he passed. I stood there frozen as he rounded a corner and disappeared from view. I darted my gaze around the woods, realizing that she still watched from the darkness. It's safe to say that the rest of the way back down the mountain was the fastest I'd ever hiked. When I reached the trailhead, I looked at the sign marking the beginning of the hike. Sweet Connie Trail. This is a memorial trail dedicated to Connie Renner, who lost her life on this same hike on 4/15/2016. At the bottom of the sign was a picture of the little girl. It's been a few months since this happened. I haven't been outdoors since, and to tell you the truth, I never want to go outside again. Screw nature, screw hiking, and screw Sweet Connie Trail. A little background before I get into it. I am a 29-year-old construction worker. Been doing it since high school. Metal framing and sheetrock mostly. I'm in decent shape. No history of mental disorders in my family. Only problem I have developed over the years is a mild case of tinnitus, from being stubborn and refusing to wear ear protection. It comes during times of silence, like when I'm trying to sleep, so I try to keep the TV or a fan on to cancel out the ringing. Work was getting very slow where I lived, so I decided to move to Virginia. I was staying with a friend who got me a sweet gig with a local construction company on Norfolk Naval Base. Huge job. 5-story building. Complete build-out from the ground up. Good pay. Not exactly close to where we were staying, but the drive wasn't bad as long as I made it out before morning traffic. Only thing wrong with the job was the foreman was a complete asshole. Always talking down to us workers in that sort of passive-aggressive tone that made me want to punch him in his face. But as long as we stayed busy, he didn't bother us for long. It was a huge job, and he had a lot of people to bug. About 4 months into it, I injured my right hand, sliced my middle finger on a piece of metal. It didn't hurt at all. The doctor stitching me up said it was because I cut so deep, it severed the nerves. The next day, I had to file an injury report and everything. My boss said he was going to put me on light duty, and that I didn't have to do anything except sweep until my hand healed. I was all for it. Same pay for easy work. For the first week, things were all right. But then it started getting boring. I mean, really boring. The days dragged on, and I wondered why they didn't just pay me to stay home. So, naturally, I started wandering the job to kill time, checking out all the hallways, and there were plenty of hallways. Really long and gloomy looking when they were just gray brick all around. Some at the very top didn't even have temporary lighting, and would have been pitch black if it weren't for the huge window cutouts on each end letting in sunlight. I stayed away from those hallways. They creeped me out. One day, I was feeling bored, so I decided to go walking around the 4th floor. Most of the work had been finished, and there weren't any other trades doing work there at the time, so I had it all to myself. It was around that time I noticed my tinnitus was acting up worse than usual. I figured someone must have had a generator running or something, so I started moving towards the other end of the hallway. About 3/4 of the way, my ears start painfully ringing. I tried sticking my fingers in my ears and humming, which usually does the trick, but the ringing was so intense. I started feeling nauseous, and I fell over on my hands and knees. I was slapping my ears, trying to make the ringing stop. My eyes started watering at one point because I was slapping my head so hard. I got up on my knees, still covering my ears, trying to get to my feet so I could make it to the stairwell. But the ringing was so intense. Every move I made sent my head spinning. Moving slow helped, but not much. As I turned around, I noticed someone standing at the other end of the hallway, near one of the window cutouts. The sun behind him was so bright, all I could see was a silhouette. I started yelling, "Help! Help!" as loud as I could, but the guy didn't move. I thought maybe he had earplugs in and couldn't hear me, so I started moving towards him, slowly, so my head wouldn't spin. As I got closer, I started noticing things I hadn't before. First, this guy was huge, like impossibly huge. His head was small in proportion to his body, and near the top of the window. His shoulders were really wide and high, almost like he was shrugging. His arms were long, hanging down past his waist, with really long fingers on each hand. I still couldn't make out any facial features because of the bright sun behind him, but as I started realizing this person wasn't normal, I slowly backed away. He just stood there, looking right at me. I was almost to the stairs when this thing slowly cocks its head to the side, like a dog does when it's confused, and the ringing in my ears just goes crazy. It was extremely painful. At the time, I thought my ears were bleeding. I was pressing my hands into my ears and yelling, but it was so loud I couldn't even hear myself yell. I dropped back on my hands and knees and threw up on the floor until I was puking air. I looked up to see if this thing was coming at me, but I caught a last glimpse of it as it walked into a nearby room. The instant it disappeared around the corner, the ringing in my ears just stopped, like someone hit the mute button. Needless to say, I ran the hell out of there and didn't look back. I stayed away from the 4th floor for the next couple months. I told a few people what I saw, but they only pretended to be interested. It was about 5 months after it happened when I decided to go back up there. I checked every room. If there were any signs of this thing, they were long gone. I went to the window where it was standing and took a measurement. The top of the window was 10 foot 9 inches. I still have tinnitus. There have been a few times when I'm laying in bed at night and the ringing gets painful, and I freak out and check every room in my apartment. But it never gets as bad as it was that day. I really hope it never does. My skin whispers now, not in tongues of flesh, but in the lexicon of rot. A crackling aria of blistered parchment, a sizzle of fat beneath flame. The mirror clings to its pretty fiction, the same ashen cheeks, the same bitten lips, still mouthing prayers the dark devours like confections. But beneath, oh, beneath churns the truth. It began where all proper corruptions do. The attic. That jar gleamed like a cataract eye amidst the dust, veined with cobwebs, breathing faintly. Inside, curled a desiccated cord, neither plant nor organ, thrumming with the rhythm of a stillborn heart. My finger brushed its crust. Idiot. Romantic fool. And it unraveled into smoke. A nest of adders slithering up my arm. Now they coil behind my navel, knitting a second skeleton. Nights are symphonies of metamorphosis. My spine crackles like wet logs, contorting into arches no human temple should bear. Shadows vomit from my throat, liquefied faces, grasping hands, leaving Rorschach blooms on the sheets. The doctors prattle of hysteria, psychosis. They never linger long enough to hear the wet purr beneath my ribs. Yesterday, my left hand blossomed. Skin split from thumb to wrist, birthing a sap that reeked of embalming spices and overripe figs. Translucent tendrils writhed from the wound, braiding themselves into a finger of polished bone. Its finger. It scribbles sonnets on my thighs, with a nail grown from my own tibia. Soon, it carves beneath my breasts.
Soon. No more pretending.
I tried immolation, poured gasoline like funeral libations over my shuddering limbs, but the match flare caught the thing's gaze in the bathroom mirror. A kaleidoscope of yellowed eyes, each reflecting a different scream. The flame guttered, the fuel thickened into a centipede broth, squirming with larval alphabets. Tonight, the cellar. Iron tang coats my tongue. The walls bleed rust. My teeth patter into cupped palms. Ivory dice tossed by a grinning dealer. The thing hums through my slack jaw now, a dirge in the tongue of drowned empires. My abdomen swells, skin gleaming like stretched wax. Something turns inside. They'll discover a deflated cradle of epidermis, brittle as a snake's shed. I'll be elsewhere, unspooled, rewoven into the thing's grand embroidery, a filament of want, a suture of static. Lean closer, press your ear to the pulse. Hear the wet click?
Beneath your own veins.